Welcome back. Joining me this week is Jan Pritzker. He's the co-founder and CTO at Swan Bitcoin and the author of one of my favorite Bitcoin books, Inventing Bitcoin. This is amazing. It's a must read, especially if you want to understand Bitcoin mining and you're not super technical like I am not. Jan, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show for the very first time.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here, Natalie. Thank you.
Well, I'm excited to learn a little bit more about you and how you got to write this book and help create what is now Swan Bitcoin. So let's start at the beginning. I know your family's originally from Ukraine, right? And you had some financial pain points that ultimately led you to why you believe Bitcoin is so important. So tell us that story.
That's right. So my family is actually from what I would call the Soviet Union, a country that doesn't exist anymore. We're not really Ukrainian. We were Soviet Jews, and in fact, when you're living in Ukraine as a Jew, your nationality is not Ukrainian; it's Jew. That's what it said in my passport, which is really interesting.
Oh,
But
wow.
anyway, yeah, it was the Soviet Union, so we didn't really have a Ukrainian identity of any sort. We only spoke Russian, for example. So I don't speak Ukrainian; I speak Russian. Um, so yeah, I grew up there, and my parents and I left in 1989, which was kind of like right around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. So the country was kind
Okay.
of, the restrictions were easing. For those people who don't know, the Soviet Union was essentially like a very locked down, socialist regime. So information was locked down. Information coming in and out was censored. You had state television. You had, I think, three channels, all state controlled. You had complete control over the economy, so there was no real pricing mechanisms. Prices were set by the government. The currency was basically a currency you could only use inside the country, and you were not allowed to hold foreign currency. So, for example, owning dollars was illegal. So dollars were like the Bitcoin of the Soviet Union. Everybody wanted some, couldn't get any, right? And when foreigners would come, foreigners would be like shown these isolated pockets where they could shop. Only foreigners could spend at these specific stores, and then people from the Soviet Union would have to like stand in line for bread or whatever. Um, so it was a pretty messed up economy. We left in '89, and there was also restrictions on leaving, by the way. So there was many periods where you just couldn't
Yeah.
even leave. And in '89 was one of those windows where they opened up, as long as you had somebody from the outside kind of like request you, sponsor you essentially. So they had to write in and say, "We'll take these people in." So we left as essentially as religious refugees, and kind of went to the U.S. And yeah, for the longest time, I didn't really know. I mean, obviously, I remember it because I was a kid, but I was about 7, so it's a little bit fuzzy. But most of what I know about the
Yeah.
Soviet Union is from my parents, right? Just from those stories.
Well,
So
and you guys couldn't bring more than $100, right? US dollars. You couldn't
yeah,
carry your wealth with you.
so that's actually something I found out quite late in life. It was actually when I got into Bitcoin. So I was watching this Andreas video. It's called Currency Wars. Still one of his best videos. Really goes through all the different things that were going on around 2013. So there was like Cyprus and Greece and all these like bank problems, and people couldn't get their money out of the banks. People were taking haircuts on their balances, and there was ATM restrictions. And he basically goes through this video and he talks about all these different countries in the world that have problems with their currency and how the government tries to implement capital controls that prevent people from leaving with their money. And you can't take this much out of the ATM per day. You can't buy this many dollars. All kinds of capital controls. And he goes through like Argentina and Turkey and Iran and Greece, all these countries that have had these problems. And after watching that video, I asked my parents at that point, like, what happened to our money, in the Soviet Union? And that's when I found out that there was a restriction and we could only exchange $100 per person when we were leaving. And that's when I was like, wow,
Wow.
I understand, the point of Bitcoin is actually, for me at least, and I think there's many points to Bitcoin, but for me it was this idea that you could leave. Like you have to have your own wealth be portable. Otherwise you're completely locked in. And so if you don't like the country and how it operates in the society you're living in, if you leave, you start from zero, which is basically what we did in the US.
Wow. So, did you know at a young age that you wanted to do something with computers and computer programming?
Yeah, I got into it kind of early. My dad was a civil engineer in Russia, and he was working with computers a lot. So he was like, doing civil engineering type of projects on computers. It was a mainframe. It was these huge machines and big rooms and little green screens and stuff. But I played on those computers as a kid, like going to my dad's job. And then when we got to the U.S., he bought me my first computer when I was 7, maybe 8. Commodore 64, one of those old ones where You had to like type in the games that you wanted to play. You had to like program them from scratch and stuff. So I kind of learned that at an early age, just playing around with computers, and yeah, just kind of grew up with that in my life.
Well, so how did you come to find Bitcoin?
Um, I think I first heard about it on Slashdot in 2011. So Slashdot is a
Okay.
site for basically it was called News for Nerds. So it's but computer news. It's essentially what Hacker News is today. I think Slashdot still exists, but nobody really goes there anymore, from what I understand.
Mhm.
But basically, it's all these cool resources, and then one day just this article popped up, something something open source money. I was like, okay, this is interesting. What does this mean? And I really kind of understood it as an open source payment system. And at that time, I was very much into open source things. I was into like Linux, which Linux is another one of
Mhm.
those things that was very nerdy in the early 2000s, and then all of a sudden it's everywhere. Every Android phone, right, is powered by Linux, right? And a lot of people don't even understand that. But open source software, that revolution was happening while I was growing up. So I was very much a part of that movement, and I was working on open source stuff. So when I heard about open source payments, open source money, I was like, okay, this is interesting. Some people are working on this kind of thing. I didn't really read it. I didn't read the white paper in 2011. I didn't understand what it was. I just read that article on Slashdot that said Bitcoin is this open source payment thing. I said, okay, this sounds interesting. How can I be part of this? I looked it up and I saw you can buy Bitcoin. Okay, I went to Mt. Gox, I bought some Bitcoin at $30. I'd never traded a single thing in my life. I'd not owned stocks. I'd never had any sort of financial assets. I just wasn't really part of my life. Not something I thought about. So I bought this Bitcoin at $30, and then of course that was the top of the bubble because when did all these articles come out? It's always at the top of the bubble, and then it crashed to
Yeah.
$2, and I was like, okay,
Oh
this
no.
is it's game over. And I sold it all at $2, and I got out, and I was like, okay,
You
this is not for
did?
me. Yeah, so I sold the bottom, bought the top, sold the bottom. Yep, you got to go through that. So that happened to me in 2011. And at that point, I had not really researched it. And it took me many years, actually. Like, then I touched it again in 2013. And then Coinbase was around. So it started feeling more legitimate because Mt. Gox was not legitimate. Like, it was very, very shady. The website was poorly designed. You had to like wire money. It was just, everything was very strange. When Coinbase came around, it seemed like it had gotten some legitimacy. So in 2013, I again kind of bought a little bit, but didn't really learn about it at all. And it wasn't until 2016 that I actually sat down and started reading what it was, and um, kind of fell down the rabbit hole with the Andreas videos. And that's really what got me into it because I finally understood that it was not just this like interesting open source payment system. It was actually a revolutionary way for people to control their own money and to have this optionality with countries that weren't working and things like that. That's kind of what I understood it to be at the time and still do.
It's time for a quick break to hear these messages from my partners who make this podcast possible. First up, Bitcoin 2024, the world's biggest Bitcoin conference, is coming to Nashville next year. Come join us for 3 full days of keynotes, panels, networking events, workshops, concerts, and more. Anything can happen here, especially if you dream of working in the industry. Ticket prices go up every month until the big event, so don't miss out. You want to get your tickets early. Head to b.tc/conference and use the code HODL, HODL, for 10% off. I'll see you in Nashville. Next up, CrowdHealth. Health insurance costs are sky high today, and you send your money every month to a massive corporation, and you never see that money again, even if you don't get sick. Luckily, there's another option, and it's all about community. CrowdHealth brings together Bitcoiners who crowdfund each other's healthcare, so you no longer have to pay fiat health insurance companies. You get to help other Bitcoiners, and they help you in return. So how it works is when someone needs a doctor or hospital visit, CrowdHealth negotiates down the medical bill lower than what insurance would be, and the community helps you fund the costs. You get to save the money you would have sent to insurance, and hey, why not put it into Bitcoin? For more information and to join, head to joincrowdhealth.com/Natalie. Yeah, it's amazing to learn from someone like Andreas because he does break it down as Bitcoin being the internet of money. And I didn't realize, I did not learn prior to Bitcoin really how the internet works. I didn't know about TCP/IP, and I think the majority of people who use this technology every single day, they really don't know how it works. But for
Mhm.
people who want to understand Bitcoin, like I said, your book has been really, really incredible. So I want to kind of play not devil's advocate, but I want to kind of put on the veil of I don't understand Bitcoin and sort of ask you about some of the most important themes in this book. But first of all, how did you come to write it? Because I know we were talking offline, and really interesting story. You were teaching high schoolers, right?
Yep, that's right. So what happened is I had this career in startups ever since I was a kid. I was, writing code and doing technical things. So I basically got into startups out of college and even before that. But essentially, the next 20 years I spent, just building stuff. So I was minding my own business, doing all this stuff, and then of course, 2016 I got the Bitcoin bug. Really, it was crypto. To be honest, I started researching Ethereum and ICOs and all this other stuff, and then it came back to Bitcoin after I understood. I started like having this sort of like as I was researching these things, I was like, wait, this is like Bitcoin, isn't it? And then I said to myself, I better understand Bitcoin because it seems like all of these things are born from that same idea. And that's when I fell into the whole, Andreas thing, and I started understanding the money aspect. And for me, you mentioned, most people don't understand TCP/IP and how the internet works. I'm the opposite. I completely understand all of that stuff. What I don't understand is how
Yeah.
money works, right? I had no idea how, like, where does money come from? Like, why is it like the way it is? The gold standard. I mean, I knew in the back of my head that we once were on a gold standard, but I had no idea about the history of that. Bretton Woods, none of that stuff. So I very quickly ended up down this monetary research rabbit hole and went like super deep and listened to Stefan Livera and like, learned Austrian economics
Mhm.
stuff and tried to get a concept about money because I felt like that was a missing piece for me. Because up until that point, Bitcoin and Ethereum and all this other stuff was just kind of like interesting decentralized technology. But once I understood the monetary aspect of it, that's when I became convinced that none of the other stuff was going to work and that Bitcoin was the one
Yeah.
to focus on. So, uh, as a way of teaching myself, I started teaching others, right? Because as I was, how it is. Once you get into Bitcoin, you can't stop talking
Yeah.
about it, right? You have to like tell
Right.
everybody, oh my God, this whole thing is insane. It's changing the world. How does everybody not see this? And it turns out it's very hard to see because you need an intersection of really good understanding of technology, really good understanding of economics and money and finance, and really good understanding of game theory, and at least a passable understanding of how energy works. Like you need a lot of stuff to come
Yeah.
together to be like, oh, I get this, right? So I was trying to simplify it down to people, and still I had not really learned all of it myself. Like I had just scratched the surface. But as I was scratching the surface for myself, I was then relaying that to my people at work and my friends. And my friends, some of them, actually many of them are teachers. I have this just community of teachers here in Chicago. And they were saying, oh, some of my kids are getting interested in Bitcoin and they hear about this blockchain thing. What does all this mean? I said, okay, I'll come give a talk. Let me try to explain it to them. And so I started doing this in, I want to say 2018. I think that was maybe 2017, potentially. So I started going to these high schools and it was kind of like end of year, career days I'd go to like math classes. I would go to different types of special, like just, they would call it like an elective class where everybody could just come in for special topics. And I would come in and try to teach people Bitcoin. And at first, it started out very, I would say, like technical. This is the blockchain, and here's how it works. And then I realized it's very
Sure.
difficult to explain it in isolation. You need history. You need to understand like money and where all that comes from. So the book started very much on the technical side of like how does the blockchain work, and then ended up being much more, here's why it's important. Like here's what's the problem
Yeah.
Satoshi was trying to solve, and let's go through the solutions.
I love it. I mean, I've always been a big believer that if you can explain something simply, that's when you really understand it. If you can explain it to,
Yeah.
a fifth grade math grad, you know it pretty well. So, okay, I don't know anything about Bitcoin. I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions, and I encourage everyone to get your book because if you really want to understand proof of work and mining and hashes and all of that, then I would say you and D++ and Andreas are our three best voices to simplify the message. So, okay,
Thank you.
what is Bitcoin mining?
So Bitcoin mining is the process of securing Bitcoin transactions. And that's a very complicated way. Even that seems complicated, right? It's like, what does that even mean? Well, I usually start with an analogy to banking because you have to send money from point A to point B today. You use your phone, you log into a bank, or you log into PayPal or Cash App or whatever it is, some sort of app. You press a button, and then that money goes to somebody else. And what I usually ask my high school students is like, how does that actually work, right? Do you just press a button and money magically travels from your phone to somebody else's phone? And the answer is, obviously no, but not everybody can actually articulate what happens. And as it turns out, what happens is there is a company in the middle, right? So your phone is talking to the company, or a bank or some sort of institution, and it's saying, change the balance on this account, from $10 to $5, and this other account goes from $5 to $10. So you're telling the bank to update the balance, and you're proving to the bank your identity. And the bank is the source of truth, and it has this ledger where it writes down all the transactions. And the point of Bitcoin is to really take that bank out of the equation and to create a system that is decentralized, has no center, no bank, and is trustless and is permissionless. Anybody can do it. You don't have to trust the other party. Anybody can join the network, right? And network is just, again, it's a bunch of people that talk to each other, right? That's the simplest thing you can think about it as a network. So when we have these two phones and we want to send Bitcoin between phone A and phone B, we still need to transmit that information, but to who? There's no company, right? So in Bitcoin, there's a decentralized network, meaning a bunch of different computers. Anybody can do it. Anybody can join. And these computers are in charge of maintaining that same ledger that the bank would normally do. But because in a bank environment, we trust the bank, we pay the bank money to secure our funds, and they have security guards, they have a vault, and they have computers. And these days they don't have much in the vault. Mostly they just have a computer, and they have some cybersecurity, right? But it's the same idea. Well, in Bitcoin, we have miners, and miners are the entities that help us keep that ledger secure and keep that ledger consistent. So they are really in charge of making sure that when we send money from phone A to phone B, or from account A to account B, that those ledger entries are properly recorded. And in order to do that, they have to do a bunch of fancy stuff because the system has to be permissionless and trustless, and anybody can use it, and and it has to work globally. And for that to work, these guys are doing special activities with their computers and proving to each other that they're keeping the ledger honest.
Okay, so I want to better understand this. You talked about a ledger. Is that the same as the blockchain? And how do you decide who's going to add the next entries in the ledger?
Yeah. So again, in a bank, a ledger is a system that the bank keeps. So when two people contact the bank and say, move money from my account to this other account, the bank is in charge of validating whether you have the money, whether you're trying to move it again and it's already been moved, all those kinds of things. So the bank has a bunch of rules they follow, right? In mining and in Bitcoin, we have the same ledger. That ledger actually exists on all the computers that participate in the Bitcoin network. So if you come home, you get a Bitcoin node set up, you can, buy a node, buy a Raspberry Pi, run a piece of software on it. It will connect to the network. It will download the ledger, and you will have the same database as everybody else. Now, how do we decide who gets the right to that ledger, right? Because arbitrarily, I could say, well, I have $1 million. I could just alter my ledger, and then I can send it around and say, why don't everybody believe my ledger? It seems like this is the source of truth, right? How do you know what the source of truth is? And so in Bitcoin,
Right. We all have
Satoshi,
to agree on this ledger. Yes.
yes, we all have to agree. Otherwise, if I send my money to Alice, and then I send my money to Bob, and I send my money to Charlie, I can send the same money over and over and pretend like that ledger hasn't changed, right? How are they going to know? And I think one naive answer to that is, well, we could kind of like vote, right? So we could just all vote on who's got the right ledger. But then we don't have trust in the system, right? So we don't know that Alice is Alice and Bob is Bob. I'm transacting with somebody across the world that I've never seen. How am I to know who they are? Are they a robot? Are they a human? With voting, you can spin up a bunch of effectively ghost machines, right? And this is called a Sybil attack. If you ever read enough Bitcoin stuff, you'll come across the idea of a Sybil attack. Basically, you can fake voting, right? Whenever there's voting, you can always create artificial votes. So the idea with Bitcoin was to lock it down, not based on voting, but based on something called proof of work. And proof of work, essentially, what it does is it requires you, in order to write to the ledger, to expend a certain amount of energy. And that makes writing to the ledger an exercise that requires real world cost. This is very important, that the Bitcoin that we generate and the transactions that we generate have real world cost to them, because that's the cost of creating an attack on the ledger and to alter it, right? So if somebody wanted to say the current Bitcoin, like I want to rewrite all of Bitcoin history, let's say, I want to pretend like, I'm Satoshi and I should have all the money. Why can't I just go and do that? Well, in order to do that, I would have to convince everybody else that my ledger is correct. And the only way to do that is with showing them my proof of work, meaning that I've expended a certain amount of energy. And right now, to rewrite the Bitcoin ledger would take you, all of the computing power of the world for, I don't know,
Mhm.
decades. I don't know what the actual number is right now, but it would be an absurd amount of computing power that you would never be able to muster to actually change all those entries, right? And to be able to convince everybody else that you've done that work.
Okay, so proof of work, we'll dig into that a little bit. So these computers are competing, right? I've heard they're called ASICs, and they're running really, really quickly and making a lot of noise and burning up energy. And what are they doing?
So one of the tricks, and this is a little bit getting into some computer science stuff, but when we talk about a distributed ledger, so the ledger exists in lots of different computers, right? If we all started writing it to the ledger at the same time, then we have to give each other all the copies of the ledger. We're going to have a problem because it's going to be basically a mess, right? Because we can't actually have a nice sequence of transactions, especially when transactions are happening all over the
Mhm.
world. So you try to do something here, and then something happened in China, and something happened in Africa. Try to combine all those transactions and having all those, things in order is very difficult. So in Bitcoin, there's a selection process that makes sure that only one entity is writing to this ledger at a time. And that is a proof of work lottery. So there's a system where you have this machine, which you said is an ASIC, which is a application specific integrated circuit, I believe. Don't quote me on that. Essentially, it's a computer chip that's designed to do one specific thing. Application specific means it's specific to Bitcoin. It only does Bitcoin. It only does a special algorithm that Bitcoin uses, and it's essentially a lottery system. So what it does is it converts energy into a certain type of guess. So in order to write to the ledger, you have to take all this data that's floating around there. So the data meaning transactional data, like I want to send money from Alice to Bob. That's a piece of transactional data. You have to take that data, put it into this computer chip, and out comes a number, essentially. And that number, I then show it to everybody else, and they tell me whether or not I've won the lottery. We can get into how that works, 'cause that's kind of the tricky part. But essentially,
Yeah.
I show people, hey, I've done this computation. Maybe it takes me, an hour. Maybe it takes me like 5 days for my computer to crunch this and find the right number. But once I found that right number, I show it to everybody. And based on the rules that we all already agreed to and our software is enforcing, everybody says is valid or not valid. And if it's valid, I get to write to the ledger. I get to write that Alice to Bob transaction to the ledger. If it's not valid, I try again and I keep going. And all over the world, miners are doing this in every possible location where there's essentially cheap energy. They're going and trying to do this.
That's what was so crazy when I learned about Bitcoin is realizing actually how simple the action that these computers are doing is, which is they're guessing really,
Yes.
really, really big numbers that our brains can't comprehend. That was the revelatory moment for me where I was like, oh, it's like rolling a really big dice over and over
Yes,
and over and over again until you hit that target number,
that's
and then
right.
you're able to potentially verify the transactions and add a block to the blockchain, the ledger.
Yeah, I've recently
And
been.
then oh, I think we have a delay. What did you
Yeah, we
say?
do. I said I'd recently been thinking of it more like a dartboard. So thinking of it like
Oh.
there's a giant dartboard, is the size of the number of atoms in the universe, right? And miners are throwing darts at it. And every time they're trying to get into a specific target size, there's a little target painted in the middle,
Mhm.
but it's a huge dartboard. It's like the size of the atoms of the universe. So they're throwing every time they're crunching a computation, they're throwing a dart at that dartboard. They're trying to hit that number, but it might take them like a billion throws or a quintillion throws to get there.
That is such a good analogy. That is such a good illustration. I think that when you can illustrate it so that someone can picture it in their mind, it makes a lot more sense. Like for me, also the analogy that helped was how is it something that's difficult to determine or difficult to guess, but easy to verify, so that everyone can agree that yes, this miner won the block. And the best analogy that I found for that was the idea of a bike lock. Right? There's a combination on it, and let's say this bike lock is very, very big. The combination is massive. But as soon as you hit the right combination, the bike lock unlocks, and everyone can verify that, hey, you were able to unlock that bike.
Yeah.
And so these are the types of things that actually really help me. But can you talk a little bit more about this target number and how it fits into hashes, which ultimately makes it very difficult if you were to try to say, um, put a fraudulent transaction or block into the chain. You're not going to have an easy time doing it.
That's right. There's two things to touch on there. So first of all, I realized that I didn't answer your question previously about ledgering and blockchain and so on. So the blockchain is the ledger. Okay, so the blockchain is a chain of
Mhm.
blocks. That's why it's a blockchain. In each block, there's a bunch of transactions, and the reason it's a chain is because we actually have history. Because with a financial system, it's really important to know money moved from Alice to Bob to Charlie, so you can trace it all the way back, so that you know that no fake money has been created in the system and nobody has spent money twice that they shouldn't have spent, and so on. So the blockchain is a history that goes all the way back to 2008, with the creation of the blockchain, and it tells us everything that happened since then in terms of where the Bitcoin came from, which is from the mining process, and how it was then spent, to the other users in the system, and so on. So we have that full transaction history. Now, as we're mining these blocks, there's a special design in Bitcoin, which is saying that somewhere in the world, roughly every 10 minutes, a block is produced. Now, how can we say something like that? Because you would think, okay, if there's 10 miners today and then tomorrow there's 100 or there's a million, the more miners that join the system, the more often they're guessing, the more likely they're going to hit that target, right? And so this is actually the fundamental innovation, I would say, in Bitcoin in many ways, because most of the other parts of Bitcoin existed way before Bitcoin. So even the idea of this proof of work, where you have to actually like do a bunch of work and create cryptographic, information on your computer, goes back to 1998. Adam Back, founder of Blockstream, is the guy who came up with that. So that existed for a long time before 2008 with Bitcoin. What didn't exist is the idea, and was unsolved, is like Adam Beck even posted about it, saying, I think this could work for a currency, except for how do we deal with it when a bunch of other computers will as computers improve, as technology improves, we can guess faster. All of a sudden, we have this problem with inflation because we can, have as many
Right?
computers in the world as possible guessing the stuff, and it will cause the currency to run away infinitely, right? We can create more and more units of this currency, and we can mine it faster, right? And so Satoshi came up
Yep.
with this very interesting thing called the difficulty adjustment, which is part of the Bitcoin algorithm, which basically what it does is it changes the size of that bullseye on the target. And it does it in a brilliant way. It's very, very simple, actually. Retroactively, you look at this thing, you're like, why didn't anybody think of this? It's so trivial, actually. It's that you look at how often the blockchain has been running, every 2 weeks roughly, or every 2016 blocks or so. You look back in history and you see how fast were they produced, and if they were produced too fast, meaning faster than 10 minutes on average, then you make that target in the middle smaller, so it's harder to hit. And if they were produced too slow, then you make that target bigger, so it's easier to hit. And so what actually happens in Bitcoin is as soon as more miners come on board, so for example, price of Bitcoin goes up, there's like a gold rush, right? Everybody says, oh my God, I should be mining. I'm going to make so much money. They plug in their machines, they start the mining process, they pay for their electrical bills, and they get their Bitcoin. But then the blockchain self-adjusts. All of the other nodes in the network self-adjust, and they say, oh, we've been going too fast. We need to make the target harder. And all of a sudden, you used to pay $100 in electricity and get $100 in Bitcoin. Now you're paying $100 in electricity, getting $90 in Bitcoin. Now you're no longer profitable. So you have a problem now, and you've got to turn your miner off. And so this system self-regulates, and it's very brilliant because it just works, right? It just self-regulates. Doesn't matter if there's somebody mining on nuclear power tomorrow. Well, they'll have an advantage for like 2 weeks, and then it'll adjust, and then everybody, it'll just get really hard, and everybody will have to start leveling up. So mining over time has caused essentially an arms race in the industry. The faster your computers, the better, the cheaper your energy, the more efficient your operations, the more Bitcoin you can mine relative to other people, and the more you can push that difficulty up. And then the people who aren't mining on the best energy, the best operations, they're going out of business, and new players are coming in to replace them.
It's ingenious. I mean, the difficulty adjustment is like it
Crazy.
blows your mind once you start to understand the technical. But okay, so that the computing power is measured in hashes. So let's talk a little bit about that target number, the hash rate, and the fact that when an input changes, it changes everything else after it. Because hashes
That's
were a
right.
little bit difficult for me to conceptualize and understand. So how do you explain that to people and why it's so difficult to hack Bitcoin?
Yeah, so there's two pieces there. There's the mining component, and there's the the spending of it, the public and private keys, and so on. So let's talk about the mining piece first. So when you're mining, what your that special chip is doing on your computer is basically taking data, like we said, the transaction from Alice to Bob. It's putting it into this special computing chip, which is running an algorithm. It's called a hashing algorithm,
Mhm.
and that produces an unpredictable number. Why is it important that it's unpredictable? Is because, we talked about people throwing darts at this dartboard. Well, if I could exactly, throw it at the target, I'll throw it at the target, right? Every time. It's actually important that when I throw it, it's completely random where it lands. It could land on the very outer edge. It could land on the side. It could land right in the middle, right? I don't know where it's going to land.
Just chance. It's a
It's just
lottery.
complete
It's
chance.
chance. It's like
Exactly.
a die.
It's
Yeah.
complete chance. So the point of this hashing algorithm is even if one bit of data changes. So for example, the transaction says send 5 Bitcoin from Alice to Bob, and then I add a number 1 on the end of it, or I add the number 2 at the end of it, or I put a letter A at the end of it, anything, I completely change where that guess will go. So I will maybe hit the bullseye or maybe I won't. No amount of additional tweaking of that data will make me more likely to hit the target. And that's really important to make this lottery fair, because otherwise somebody could just, game it and just, always hit the target, right? The hashing algorithm actually prevents anybody from cheating because it is completely random. And that's something that Bitcoin didn't invent. Hashing is actually fundamental to all cryptography, all modern computing, all the internet communications are using these concepts, right? So that's the component of mining. So mining is very hard to hack or maybe impossible because of this hashing algorithm. But also the spending of the Bitcoin relates to cryptography and relates to some of this stuff as well, right? Because you actually are encrypting information, and cryptography and hashing are very closely related. Basically, it's the same idea. You're taking information, except for with cryptography, you usually have 2 keys. So in this situation, you have a key that you have that you can encrypt information with, and you have a key that other people have that they can decrypt with, for example. And that's how information is passed on the internet for anything. Like if you're doing banking, connecting to a website, there's always encryption involved. In Bitcoin, that encryption is used to create signatures, which is like signing a check. So when I'm spending my Bitcoin, I use a key that only I have to encrypt that information, and then I can publish it, and everybody can independently verify that it was my signature, my key was used to sign that transaction. And that part is also is the same idea as the Bitcoin mining thing, where the number of possible keys in the universe is as big as the number of atoms. So it's impossible to just, accidentally create that signature. You have to have the key.
It's time for another quick break to hear these messages from my partners. I'm excited to share that I'm an advisor for the Orange Pill app. If you haven't downloaded this app yet, you're missing out on connecting with Bitcoiners in your area. The Orange Pill app is focused on building the social layer for Bitcoin and helping create opportunities for in-person connections and community building. You create a profile and you'll see lots of familiar faces, and then you can search for Bitcoiners and Bitcoin events based on your location. I'm geotagged in my home base, St. Louis, and I'm excited that Orange Pill app has allowed me to meet new people in my city. Come join us, use my referral code in the show notes, and start connecting today. Next up, I want to take a moment to recommend an outstanding recent book in the Bitcoin space, Bitcoin Evangelism by Brian DeMint. I've had the chance to have Brian on the show, and this is really the ultimate tool for orange pilling your friends, your family, your coworkers, and it will make you a more effective messenger for Bitcoin. We all have that story of how we disregarded Bitcoin the first time we heard about it because either the arguments weren't compelling enough or maybe they weren't framed in a way that we could easily grasp them. Think of something like trustlessness or immutability. These are concepts that now we understand as Bitcoiners, but how do you explain them simply to someone totally new in the space? Well, Bitcoin Evangelism will help you do that. It will allow you to become a Bitcoin evangelist so that we orange pill millions of new Bitcoiners in the new year. Head to the link in my show notes to buy the book today. It's so amazing that we are at a point where all of this, decades of research and development and work in cryptography culminated in something as perfect as Bitcoin. Because I think it's Lynn that talks about this in Broken Money. Maybe the perfect one would have been the 3rd or 4th iteration of a cryptocurrency, but it was really the first. Bitcoin, the first one, is the best. It's the most perfectly engineered form of money. And going back to what you mentioned earlier and why ultimately you decided that Bitcoin's the one you want to focus on because it solves the problems with money. Can you talk a little bit about that and help people understand who maybe are looking at the space and want to invest in all these different types of protocols, and they hear institutions are applying for Ethereum, spot Ethereum ETFs and all that? Like, why is it just Bitcoin for you?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, it wasn't really the first. I want to correct that a little bit, because research into cryptocurrencies, maybe they weren't called cryptocurrencies, but certainly there was talk about e-cash and private currencies, digital currencies, long before Bitcoin. Bitcoin, I would argue, is the
Sure.
culmination of all that research. For example, there was even like David Chaum had this DigiCash. It was a company, right? It was a company that issued
Hmm.
digitally cryptographic cash that you could spend outside of well, from peer to peer, sort of, but you had to register it with their server, right? So they're still a central company. And so the problem that they couldn't solve is how to get rid of the company. So the idea of digital currency, cryptographic based currency existed. The idea of like proof of work existed. But what hadn't been done was the removal of trust and permission from the system. And that
Hmm.
ultimately is what solved the problem, right? If we're talking about what problem was Satoshi trying to solve, if you read his writing, he was talking about there's a problem with trust in general in currencies. You have to trust for the government not to debase them. You have to trust for the bank not to rug pull you, et cetera, et cetera. You have to trust people with your privacy information. With Bitcoin, you can generate an anonymous account. You can mine your own Bitcoin. You've got that Bitcoin, and you don't need to register it with any company. You don't need to get anybody's permission to use it. You can send it peer to peer. Miners could be anybody in the world. So that concept was the solution. So once that problem had been solved, it's like the discovery of gold or the discovery of nuclear power. It's like we discovered uranium, we discovered gold. It's already discovered. Like, I mean, you can discover another element and say, look, it's better than gold because it's X, Y, and Z. But the thing is that the X, Y, and Z for Bitcoin are hardness, meaning you can't produce more of them, right? And the trustless and immutable nature of it. And so
Hmm.
now what you're saying is, okay, we figured out Bitcoin, it exists. We know that there's a system that has ultimate hardness, meaning we can verify for a fact that no more of them can be produced than 21 million, which, by the way, is actually a natural consequence of this whole difficulty adjustment thing and how Bitcoin's issuance is designed, is just designed to over time become scarcer and scarcer in the algorithm. So once that was implemented,
Hmm.
and once enough computers in the world were following those rules, you cannot change the rules any longer because every computer is verifying those rules, including not even miners, but when somebody sends me Bitcoin on my Bitcoin node, it will validate that the miner who produced it didn't
Hmm.
cheat in any way. So that's what keeps the system intact and honest and so on. And so now we all have the system that is sort of perfect. It solved these problems. And now you're saying, okay, but now we have this other system. It was started by a company, basically started by a group of people, and they're selling it for Bitcoin. Right away, you've got a problem because why would I buy the thing that was generated by a bunch of people versus the thing that already exists and has already solved the problem of decentralization, trustlessness, permissionless, all those things? And there's a thing where that you really understand better once you understand monetary theory is that liquidity begets liquidity. Okay, if I am a large purchaser of Bitcoin. Let's not talk about the person trying to buy $10 worth of Doge, but let's talk about the people who are making the decisions of putting $1 billion in. I have $1 billion to allocate. I could buy $1 billion of Bitcoin, which has a market cap of close to $1 trillion, or I could buy $1 billion of Ethereum, which has half that amount, let's say. And there's also the liquidity of like
Hmm.
how easy would it be for me to sell it later, right? How accepted is it in the world? How confident am I if I had to sit on it for 100 years that I could still give it to somebody else in 100 years and it would still be there? Those are the decisions you have to make as an individual when you're investing in something, and you can't invest in the two things at the same time. If I have $1, I either buy the Bitcoin or buy the Ethereum. I could split it 50-50, but then one of those 50s is going up and the other one's going down because it's a closed system, right? It's There's only a certain pot of money in the world that's going into all these different assets. So I either buy real estate, or I buy a car, or I buy land, or I buy Bitcoin, or I buy Ethereum. So if you've decided that this is the future of money, then why would you buy the thing that has a group of people selling it rather than a truly decentralized system? Why would you buy the one that's less liquid than the one that's more liquid? Why would you buy the one that you're not certain about for 100 years from now, that whether your kids would be able to access it if you left it as inheritance, right? That is fundamentally what the types of decisions that people make as individuals that collectively cause Bitcoin to have a reflexive effect. The more people think about this, the more
Hmm.
they choose Bitcoin, and the more they choose Bitcoin, the more other people that think about it have to also choose Bitcoin. And this
Right.
concept was described by Karl Menger, who was an Austrian economist, who kind of theorized about how money might have come to be. Because why would you hold wheat when you can hold gold? Because wheat, well, it spoils.
Mhm.
Gold is hard, right? Wheat you can easily produce more of. Gold you can't. So these are the kinds of things that each individual evaluates, and as they do so, they create this collective effect where Bitcoin becomes number one.
Can you explain when we maybe hit that inflection point where Bitcoin would be too difficult and too expensive to 51% attack? And it isn't a situation where people think, oh, well, there was MySpace first and then there was Facebook, and no one uses MySpace anymore, that this is truly uniquely different and we pass that event horizon?
When did that happen? I don't really know. I think it happened very quickly, though. I think it happened within the first 1 or 2 years of Bitcoin because it quickly
Really?
became sufficiently like it became sufficiently distributed. I would say in terms of the number of computers that were involved in the network, and everything that came after it. I think fundamentally the problem was 99% of the things that came after it were launched by companies. So that right away disqualifies them, right? So even like Ethereum,
Mhm.
you can argue, is it a commodity, is it not a commodity? But a group of people launched it and they sold it for Bitcoin. And they kept 70% of the Ethereum for themselves. So I mean, basically there was a company, right? So there are other cryptocurrencies that launched, let's call it fair launch or weren't pre-mined or whatever. Um, those are the only true competitors to Bitcoin. I would completely throw away anything that was launched by a company because there's a central point of control. Those people still hold the majority
Yeah.
and they still can influence the system. With Bitcoin, holding the
Mhm.
majority of Bitcoin does not let you have any special rights in Bitcoin. That's one interesting thing about it is you could buy up like 99% of the supply. If you can manage that, you still can't change the rules of Bitcoin because ultimately it's the economic nodes that receive your payments, like a merchant or whatever that's getting the Bitcoin payment that enforces it. So if you send them something that doesn't follow the rules, they throw it out. So I would right away disqualify anything that was launched by a company or that had sort of pre-mine or whatever. It cannot be money. So take it out of the equation.
Mhm.
Then you have the other stuff that's left over, like the Doge coins and the Litecoins and whatever other coins there are. And there are many tens of thousands of them at this point. Effectively, they're just clones of Bitcoin with some sort of tweakage, right? And I
Yeah.
would really encourage people on this topic to read an article by Jimmy Song. It's called "On Altcoin Valuation," where he talks about, why did Litecoin actually succeed for a while? Why did it have a lot of marketing buzz and kind of have a few pumps and so on? Where there was another coin just like Litecoin, I forget the name, Tenebricks or Fairbricks or something, that had been by the same guy with the same stuff, like just 6 months prior that didn't catch, and it's 100% because of marketing, right? Whatever the good marketing is for these coins, that's what causes the pumps. That's what causes people to buy in. They think, oh my God, Litecoin is a silver to Bitcoin's gold. That was its tagline. And when I came in 2016, 2017, I totally bought it. I was like, wow, Litecoin's a silver to Bitcoin's gold. It's faster. Why would you you could hold your Bitcoin, but you'd spend your Litecoin. This kind of nonsense is marketing. And the only reason it works is because people have a faulty understanding of monetary behavior. Because in the world,
Mhm.
you have dollars and you have euros and you have yen and stuff like that, and you think, yeah, why shouldn't there be many currencies, right? It makes sense. But actually,
Right.
is that how it works? Let's break that down. Because in countries where their currency doesn't work, they want dollars, and in countries where the currency mostly works, they still want dollars. So if they had a choice, they would pick the dollar because the dollar is the dominant, most liquid, most hard, actually, relative to other currencies. It's the best one, right? So the only reason people hold other currencies is because they're being held hostage because the government is forcing them to do that. They're saying you have to pay taxes in this currency. If you don't do this, you want to leave this country, we'll take it away from you. You're at gunpoint
Mhm.
to have to use this currency. Nobody in Venezuela wants Venezuelan bolivars, right? I mean, that's nonsense. So we've broken free of that system because we are now in a free market. We're on the internet. So all currencies compete equally. So Bitcoin now competes perfectly with every other thing that looks like Bitcoin. So again, now it comes back to the liquidity thing. Why would you buy Litecoin and see it go down relative in value to Bitcoin? It doesn't make sense. So it all comes back to Bitcoin.
Yeah, it speaks to the power of network effect. And there are other proof of work coins and protocols out there, but they're like little grains of sand compared to the mountain that is Bitcoin. And
That's
it's
right.
very difficult to try to channel. I mean, you could channel the energy that powers the US Navy and you wouldn't be able to attack Bitcoin, which actually I wanted to ask you because there's this great clip of Andreas Antonopoulos from way earlier on, and he's answering the question of whether Bitcoin could be 51% attacked. Like, let's say some entity or nation state was able to harness that amount of energy and capture the blockchain. He basically, I mean, I couldn't repeat how eloquently he put it, but he said there's a fix to it, and you could basically undo that block or the couple of blocks and like send them on their way. Can you kind of break down what a 51% attack would look like today and how we would solve for it?
Yeah, so I think let's break down what 51% means because a lot of people hear the word attack and it's like, oh my God, it's very scary, right? So
Yeah.
a 51% attack is when 51% or just over 50% of the miners have been taken over by a malicious entity and they want to do something bad to Bitcoin. So let's first define what are
Mm-hmm.
the bad things that they can do to Bitcoin, right? For example, can they create Bitcoin out of thin air and inflate and create inflation in the system? The answer is no, because if they do that, then the block they mine that contains this extra Bitcoin and they try to send it somewhere to spend it. Let's say they send it to an exchange, they send it to a merchant to buy alpaca socks or whatever, it'll just get rejected everywhere because it's an invalid block. So the 51% attack that tries to change the rules of Bitcoin cannot succeed. Doesn't matter. Because it's not the miners that matter. It's actually the nodes that receive it in payment. Miners are they're essentially like, I don't want to say that they're subservient to the users, but in many ways, they are just there to provide a service. They're there to mine the Bitcoin. They're there to secure the transactions. If they violate the rules, their block won't be accepted by anybody. So they have a strong economic incentive because, again, proof of work, remember that part, they're burning a ton of energy. So let's say they spend $100,000 mining a block. If they mess up that block and it's not accepted by anybody, that's $100,000 that just burned into the air. So most attacks are disincentivized by simply that. But now we're talking about really bad guys like the government, right? The really, really bad guys that are not economically incentivized. They're not trying to make money. They're trying to just ruin the whole system. What can they do? So they're not going to try to print new Bitcoin because that's not going to work. They can't spend Bitcoin that's not theirs because that's not going to work because that requires transaction signatures and all that. What they can do is they can mine a block and censor stuff. So they can say, yeah, I'll produce a block, but I don't have to put any transactions into it. I can make it empty, for example, or I can make it so that it only has transactions that I like. That they can do. So that's the worst possible attack on Bitcoin. I would say it's probably like starvation. So they could just keep creating empty blocks, right? Um, However, it's important to understand that there's a fee market, and so people will keep paying higher and higher fees to include the Bitcoin transactions that they want into this. So they're essentially creating an incentive for people to pay fees to the honest miners, whoever's left over. Let's say the government's got 50% of it. Let's say it's China. And then, the rest of the world is still trying to make Bitcoin work. They still want to get paid. Ultimately, by the way, it's not an altruistic thing. It's not like miners are there just having fun. They're getting paid for the service and quite a lot. So they have a strong incentive. Oh, my government's shutting me down, like in China? Boom, I'm gone. They're going to Kazakhstan. They're in Texas now. They left and now they're in different places and now they're mining just fine, right? So as soon as we have that sort of action where somebody's trying to, do this 51% attack, we're actually strongly incentivizing people to pay the rest of the miners. And so now all of a sudden, this government or whatever entity that's trying to stop Bitcoin has to constantly be on the competition with these people that are out there looking for the cheapest possible sources of energy and cheapest possible operations and are being incentivized financially to do so. It's kind of like playing whack-a-mole, right? And even if they succeed in starving the chain for some time, I mean, talking about like rewriting the chain or going back in time and messing up a bunch of blocks is very, very hard because now they're trying to do that with all of the energy in the world. I mean, Bitcoin, some of the detractors of Bitcoin say Bitcoin uses as much energy as entire countries. And yeah, that's true, except for it's not in one place, right? It's everywhere. It's like tiny little pockets everywhere. So imagine trying to compete with that and at the same time incentivizing that size of energy pile to grow while you're trying to basically spend an infinite amount of money keeping up with it. It's just not going to succeed in the long run. And at some point you have to give up or you have to keep this attack going indefinitely, like literally until the end of time.
Yeah.
And,
Yep. Well, well, you made me think of a question. You made me think of a question, but first of all, have you seen Jurassic Park?
yeah,
You know the mosquito that's covered by all the amber? I
yeah,
I literally sometimes think about that when it comes to the blocks because it's like layer after layer after layer after
that's
layer
right.
built on top where you cannot get in there and do anything ultimately. I mean, you might be able to affect some of the top layers, but that's it. Like it's game over.
That's
That
right.
that mosquito is etched in there for eternity. But you made me think of the question of centralization risks because one thing that I've learned recently is that there aren't that many mining pools out there. And obviously, small miners are encouraged to join pools because they have a better chance of actually, earning some Bitcoin subsidies. Do you worry about that? Like, what are the centralization risks in Bitcoin and how do we mitigate them? And we could talk about everything from the pools to some people think it's a risk that these institutions are coming in and they're all going to custody Bitcoin for things like the ETF vehicles. So what are your thoughts? What are the risks of centralization and how are they mitigated?
Yeah, I mean there's some legitimate concerns there. I think as far as pools, so just to describe pools for people who might be new to it, you have a miner, which is throwing darts at the dartboard, and maybe you hit one today, maybe it takes you a month, maybe it takes you a year. So that makes mining a very risky business because you could spend a lot of money on energy and never hit a block. So what miners have done over the time, over the history of Bitcoin, is they've pooled together. So it's just like insurance; they all come together, they all mine together, and if they if they hit a block, they distribute the rewards to everybody equally or proportionally to the contributions that they've made in hash rate. So essentially, how much computation power they've put in and how much energy they've burned.
Yeah.
So that has caused over time centralization. So there are pools that have a lot of hash rate. They might have 40-50% over time. And in fact, I think in 2014 there was a pool called Ghash which had more than 50% of the hash rate. And miners at that point saw that was happening and actually voluntarily started switching off that pool to prevent that one pool from having control. Today, I'm not actually sure what the current stats are, but I do know that I think more than the 50% of the hash rate is now in the U.S., I believe, or at least close to 50%. So there's jurisdictional centralization, which we saw with China. China used to have like 50% of the hash rate, and the answer to that was, well, China decided to ban it. They decided to ban Bitcoin
Mm-hmm.
and ban Bitcoin miners, and all of those Bitcoin miners went to Kazakhstan and Texas for the most part. And of course, there's still clandestine mining operations in China. It's not like they actually shut anything down. But
Yeah.
but most of the hash rate left China and went to other places. So that's one answer to what happens when there's too much centralization from a jurisdictional standpoint. Like when a country is really against something, it'll cause it to go elsewhere. With the pools, the answer to centralization is that pools aren't miners. Pools are pools, and a miner can literally hop between pools every second if they wanted to. It's a piece of software; they can point themselves somewhere else. So if a pool is misbehaving or acting in a way that the miner doesn't like, they can switch pretty easily. Um, Now,
Mm-hmm.
there is now a push from the US government specifically, and probably other governments over time, that these pools should be like KYCing people or following OFAC restrictions, which are basically saying, you can't send this Bitcoin to
Yeah.
Iran or North Korea or wherever,
Right.
whatever has been sanctioned.
And some have already complied. Like there has been some
Yes.
level of censorship with like the OFAC compliance and all that.
Yes, there's been levels of compliance for sure, especially like if you're a public company in the US, you've got to comply with that kind of stuff. I mean, it's the
Mhm.
government.
Yeah.
So that is a risk. There's a risk that, governments, again, there's some jurisdictional arbitrage. Like if you really don't want to comply, okay, go and operate out of, El Salvador or somewhere else that doesn't have this restriction. So there's always going to be some jurisdictional arbitrage. But I also think we have to be realistic and say, places like the US and leaders in sort of, where the hash rate is probably where the pools are going to end up, and there's going to be some amount of that compliance for sure. So that's a risk. I don't know what we do about it other than you always have a choice, right? You don't want to be here, leave the country, go somewhere else. That's actually the point of Bitcoin, is to give you a choice to leave the country, because at the end of the day, that's the pressure valve that we have against our government is if we're not happy,
Yeah.
we take to the streets or we just leave and we have brain drain, and the governments at the end of the day, they crumble, because like that's what happened to the Soviet Union. Brain drain. Everybody who had the means and the brains left. And now they're in the U.S. and look at all the successful immigrants over here, right? Like that's why the U.S. was so good to begin with. But if they're gonna give all that up by being totalitarian, well, the immigrants are gonna go somewhere else. That's what happens. But yeah, that's
Yeah.
a risk.
No, you do bring up some good points. Before we start to wrap up, I want to ask you your thoughts on privacy, because I think that with Bitcoin in general, it's pseudonymous, and once you have one wallet, you can track it a lot of places, and so it's not completely private, and I don't think it was necessarily designed to be completely anonymous. What do you think about that? And going forward, I think that most people they don't there's a difference between privacy and secrecy, right? Like everyone is entitled to privacy. Secrecy kind of has that connotation of you're trying to hide something, you're doing something illicit. The majority of people are not doing anything like that, especially
Mhm.
with regards to Bitcoin. They just want to make sure that, their balance isn't out there for the public to see and be able to track and trace. So what is the solution on that end to make sure that we protect financial privacy?
Yeah, I think that's a really good call out. The Bitcoin blockchain is completely public. You can go and look it up on a block explorer. You can download it on your own node. Bitcoin was designed with that in mind for transparency of supply. I think that's like the auditability of Bitcoin was number one. We want to make sure we can follow transactions. Like we know that no fake money entered into the system, nobody was double spent, and so on. The trade-off is privacy. So with cash, I would say, back in the day, we used to have these like green pieces of paper, which probably nobody remembers anymore as we speak. You used to be able to go and spend stuff, right? And now you use Visa and you use Apple Pay and everything's digital, right? When we went from cash to digital, we gave up all the privacy because all the digital transactions are completely monitored, completely surveilled.
Yeah.
All banks have to report this stuff. The government took that opportunity, and this happened in 1970 with the creation of the Bank Secrecy Act. They took an opportunity, seeing that everything was going digital, and this was early, like 1970s, very early. Um, they're pretty forward thinking. They're like, why don't we monitor it all? That sounds great. And basically, now they can monitor every single transaction. And the only way you can have privacy is if you actually use paper cash. So Bitcoin has the same problem. Bitcoin being a digital thing, it's pretty easy to look at. You can follow, transactions. So we do need a cash-like layer on Bitcoin. That could take lots of different there's lots of approaches. There's the idea of mixing, which is basically where or a coin join, you come together with other people and you make your Bitcoin more anonymous. You slice it up into chunks. It's similar to when you withdraw cash from an ATM. Instead of having your full paycheck in there, you now have like $100 bills, and you can go and spend them how you like. Right now with Bitcoin, if I buy Bitcoin, and let's say I bought $1,000 worth of Bitcoin, if I try to go to a merchant and spend that Bitcoin, they're going to see that I'm spending $1,000 bill. Essentially, they're going to see that whole chunk.
Mhm.
So I think that's a major problem that most people who use Bitcoin probably don't even think about. But imagine like going down to another country, you're traveling, and you want to spend your Bitcoin, and all of a sudden you accidentally reveal that you have a large Bitcoin balance. That actually puts you at physical risk, I would argue. So we want to have privacy on Bitcoin for that reason. You don't want to have the merchant know what you're doing. You don't really want to see, you don't want to have the bank following you home either. That's really creepy. But essentially, the Bitcoin blockchain allows for that to happen, which means we need privacy technology. So coin joins, there's also like Lightning Network, right, which kind of offers some of that privacy because a lot of the spends are not being recorded on the chain. There's side chains like Liquid. There's all kinds of different solutions. I think we're in
Yeah.
day one of this. We're going to see a lot more down the road.
Well, you bring up such a great point because sometimes I've been asked about, well, why should we have coin joins and coin mixers? Like, why can't we just spend and if no one's doing anything that is illicit, then why would they be uncomfortable knowing that someone went to the coffee shop or whatever? And it's like, well, the fact that you can trace it to a full balance
Mm-hmm.
potentially, that's what could put people truly at risk. Yeah, someone could assume that you have so much Bitcoin and then you could be targeted. And so that does create some, fear in
Yeah.
people, especially those who were early.
I think
Luckily, I'm
that
not early
analogy of
enough
the
to.
of the paycheck is really important. I think like just let's make it drive it home that I'm not going to walk around like I'm not going to go traveling with a $5,000
Yeah,
bill and like spend it at the street
right.
merchant. Like am I trying to get mugged? No, like I will break it up into small
Yeah,
pieces, right? So I think that's
yeah.
really important.
Okay, I really wanted to ask you this question because I go to conferences and sometimes I hear from total newbies in the space that their biggest obstacle and the thing that makes them most hesitant about Bitcoin is the fact that we don't know Satoshi Nakamoto's identity, and they worry that it could be a bad actor, it could be a rogue nation state or the CIA, and that somehow that wallet with the million Bitcoins could somehow be compromised, and then that would be the downfall of the network. How do you respond to that? Should we care that we don't know who Satoshi is?
I don't think we should care. I think it's actually a benefit because in all other instances of these cryptos being created, they're basically created by somebody that is well understood. I mean, there's some cases where the founder is anonymous, but in most cases, it was a company, a group of people, or somebody, some individual, and that's always a point of control and coercion because somebody could go to that person and say, "Okay, hey, like the government or bad actors and actually coerce them to do something bad. And in many of these systems, these people have undue influence. Like they can actually change the rules. They can suggest a hard fork, which is like a type of rule change, which, for example, in Ethereum happens like more than once a year in many cases, right? It's like, hey, let's just change our monetary policy. No big deal. In Bitcoin, there's no such person, and that's really important. First of all, it's also very hard, even if there was such a person, to have them change anything, simply because of the distributed nature of the system and because it is truly decentralized. But nonetheless, not having a central point of control is useful. And Satoshi like voluntarily stepped away, right? He disappeared very early in the project. He also, many people don't know this, but there's a messaging system inside of Bitcoin where you could used to be able to send alerts like, hey, do X, Y, and Z. Like Satoshi had a key to do this thing, and they actually disabled that too. So over time, Bitcoin has become much more decentralized because these points of control, even though the messaging system wouldn't actually do anything, but imagine Satoshi saying, hey guys, the system's been compromised by NSA, everybody dump your coins. Like that would be very bad. So actually removing that power from the Satoshi entity was very important. So I would argue that this piece of Bitcoin is actually really special and magical. Very few other coins have tried to reproduce it. What if Satoshi is alive and has complete control of these wallets and wants to dump all of his Bitcoin in the market tomorrow and like cause a massive crash? Yeah, that could happen. And then what, right? What happens over the next 5, 10, 50, 100 years? You have to think on a much longer time scale here. Bitcoin's here to stay for a long time. So that event would be nothing in the scope of its history.
Yeah, no, I'm glad we don't know the identity either. It was a generous gift to the world, and we would peel back the layers of their whole lives, right? I mean, that's what we would ultimately do. I really just want to promote your book again. Before we take off, any updates? I know that Swan has a couple of exciting announcements, and you've been working hard there to grow the company. So anything you want to share before we leave the viewers and listeners?
Yeah, no, just thank you for having me. Swan's been a great ride as well. We've been building our institutional arm. We'll be launching a bunch of stuff this year, which is really big. And I think it's really important for us to address Bitcoin adoption at all layers. And this is something we're doing here at Swan, looking at the bottom layer and the bottom up layer where we go and orange pill a bunch of people. We're also looking at the top down layer. Can we orange pill a company and get all of their employees onto Bitcoin, right? So from the institutional side, from the bottom up, coming at it from both sides, and really trying to orange pill the world is kind of our mission. And I think we'll see a lot of exciting stuff happen this year.
I love it. Well, it's such an honor to know you. Like I said, you're absolutely brilliant being able to explain this the way that you do. And I will link to all of your work and information below. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Natalie. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for checking out the video version of my show. Remember, this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing constitutes as official investment advice, and you should always do your own research. Please reach out if you have guest suggestions or any feedback. My email is natalie@talkingbitcoin.com, and I'll see you next time.